sitting down with Mr. Bill Toms, Safety Director with MB Haynes here in Asheville. He's got a very interesting story that we want to be able to discuss with everyone, and want to talk to you a little bit about how did you get started in the utility business, and tell us a little bit about it.
Well, when I was a young kid, just fresh out of high school, I decided I wanted to go into the Air Force. And you weren't guaranteed a job when you went in, but they would let you pick a field. And so I chose electrical because I thought being an electrician would be a good skill to have. And so they sent me to boot camp and then the technical school. And it was kind of funny because one day they took a group of us out and there was a pole there, and they had us climb this ladder and get to the top and tie it off and then lean back. And if you didn't freak out, then you're going to be a lineman. And so then they gave us a set of gaffs and strapped those on and said, take a couple steps up a pole, which I did. And they said, you passed, you're going to be a lineman. So then they shipped me off to technical school, and that's where I learned to do line work.
And then after you got out?
That was in 1984, yeah.
And once you got out of the military, you went to work for a contractor. Who did you go to work for?
MB Haynes Corporation. I spent 4 years in the Air Force, and then from 84 to 88, and then in 88 went to work for MB Haynes Corporation. Been there ever since.
And back in 1997, you were working, regular day, cold day, probably January 31st, 1997. Take us back to that day, things that happened going up to that day, and then what occurred that day.
Well, the job that we were on was it was a large reconductoring job, and what that means is when you have a line going through an area, this was a rural area out in the country, and so it was a three-phase line energized at 7,200 volts. Well, you can't just turn the power off, to pull in new lines. So what we have to do is we go in there and we outrig the poles and we lay the old conductors out. We spread them out so that we can frame the pole for the new conductors, and then we pull the new conductors in. And then the last step of that is that we go through and we transfer the load. At each pole we transfer it from the old wire over to the new wire. And so that's what we're doing on this particular day. And like I said, this was like a 3-mile job. We'd been working there for a couple months, so it's, you kind of get complacent doing the same thing day in and day out. So here we were transferring the load, and on this particular pole it was just me and a groundman. The rest of the crew had gone on up the road to work on other poles. But I climbed the pole. It was inaccessible because it was up on a bank in someone's backyard. But I climbed the pole, and there was a tap line, and what that is a line that comes off of this pole and it goes across the road and feeds another residence. Well, on this particular pole, there was a fuse disconnect that we had installed on the new cross arm, and it had a new jumper wire coming out of the bottom of it. And so what my task was to take that jumper wire and uncoil it and pull it down and make a compression connection on the tap line. And so I figured the wire's not energized, so I don't really need my rubber gloves. I'll just take a shortcut. And I had my rubber gloves. They're rated at 20,000 volts. Had those hanging on my belt. But I just reached up with a leather glove on, and I grabbed this jumper wire.
Which you've probably done numerous times. Same thing that you've done week in and week out.
What I didn't realize is that the wire coming out of the top of the fuse disconnect went around behind the pole and was actually connected to the energized wire. And so, had I seen that or realized that, I would have touched the wire without my gloves on.
Right.
But so when I reached up with just a leather glove on and I touched this wire, it wouldn't let me go. So I was just stuck on this wire, and I could feel the loud hum of the 7,200 volts surging through my body. And I was like, Lord, I've messed up now. And I said, if this is it for me, I'm ready to go, but take care of my children. I had 2 young children at the time. And that lasted, it seemed like slow motion. Yeah, it was almost like surreal. Like I remember looking down the line and I could see the sag of the wires going to the next pole. And I'm sure it was just instantaneous, just like that.
Right.
But eventually I passed out. And then
you were up the pole by yourself?
Yes.
And it went in your arm?
Yeah, it went in through my right hand and exited through my right foot.
And you have a boot to show us exactly where the exit point was.
Yes. This is my right boot, and as you can see, it went in through my right hand, went down through my body, and it exited right here because this is the point that was closest to the wooden pole that I was standing on. And this hole, I don't know if you can see it well enough, but it's actually big enough that you could stick a pencil in it. That's what the voltage did, is it just burned its way through.
So we had 7,200 volts going through.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've probably blanked out.
Yes.
Take us from that point on, what had happened in your recovery process?
So when I was laying there on the ground at the bottom of the pole, I remember looking down at my leather work glove, and I could see there was a hole burned in the tip of my index finger. And I looked down in there, and I could see it was just black like charcoal. And EMS arrived about the same time, and when they pulled my boot off, I could see the same thing. The sock was burned, and there was a charring on my big toe. And so, okay, the ambulance, they loaded me up, rushed me to the hospital. Of course, the hospital was a good probably 25 minutes away, so the ride seemed like forever because they couldn't give me any pain medicine because they wanted the doctors to be able to assess my condition. When I got to the hospital, all the nurses and doctors, they came swarming in. They were all checking me out, and I remember them saying, "Mr. Toms, do you have any allergies?" And I said, "Yeah, electricity." So they got a chuckle out of that. But anyway, that was about the last thing I remembered. They had called for the helicopter from the Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem.
So they flew you from Asheville out to Winston-Salem.
Yes.
So now your family's on their way out there. And what happens once you land at Baptist?
Well, once I got there, they immediately rushed me into ICU and then on to emergency surgery because what happens is infection sets in and, part of your flesh starts dying.
Yeah.
So they wanted to get a handle on this as soon as they could. So they rushed me into surgery. They did the amputations, and I don't remember if it was the next day or the day after, but I remember waking up in the room, and I was like, wow, at least I'm still alive.
Yeah.
And I remember looking down at my arm, and I had all this bandages and suction tubes coming out. And then I looked down at my foot, and I could see that my foot was missing, but same thing down there. I had all these bandages and all these suction tubes, and they were actually doing a new procedure where they had the constant vacuum on the limbs because it makes a lot of fluid when you have a burn, and so this constantly sucks the fluid off, and so it helps with the pain. Plus, it's better to have it out. So.
So what was your recovery process like? How long were you after the surgery? Were you in the hospital?
Well, I stayed down there for 10 days. I had a total of 5 surgeries because what they do is they take off as little bit as possible, and then they monitor it. And if they see that it's starting to get infected or that part's dying, they go back and take a little bit more.
Right.
So I had 5 surgeries over the course of those first few days. And then they got me stabilized. And at that point, the prosthetists came in and they fitted me with a temporary foot on the end of my stump. And so, I couldn't walk on it, but it was just there kind of as to get used to it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And after I'd stayed there 10 days, they checked me off and sent me back to Asheville. And so I went to a rehab hospital here in town and ended up staying there 7 days. And while I was there, I did physical therapy. I did occupational therapy where you learn
how to grab.
See, I was right-handed at the time, so I was going to have to learn to do everything left-handed. Even though being in line work, climbing poles, you don't always get to use your dominant hand. So I was proficient with using both hands.
And you went through the rehabilitation process. All your life you've been right-handed.
Yes.
Now all of a sudden you're left-handed.
Yeah.
So at 31 years old, when the time of this accident, you've done everything in your whole life right-handed.
Yes.
Now it's like learning how to walk all over again and do everything with your left hand.
Yeah.
Take us through that process of how you went through basically learning how to live all over again, doing things opposite of what you had been doing.
You know, everything was different. I had a straight drive truck at the time, so I would drive it. I'd have to reach over and shift with my left hand. Going to the bathroom is different.
Exactly.
Showering, everything.
You're learning everything completely over. One thing that if you could do or tell everybody out in this industry, what would you tell them? Where would you start?
Well, there's a couple things, and this is what I tell our new employees regularly, is you got to have situational awareness. You know, if I'd been paying attention that this wire went around the other side of the pole and was connected, then, you know, of course I'm not going to touch that wire. The other thing is using your personal protective equipment. I had mine hanging on my belt that day, and they didn't do me any good. And then the third thing is, you know, avoid complacency. We do the same task day in and day out. You get used to it, and you take shortcuts, because when you do something and nothing bad happens, then you tend just to repeat it again.
We talked about in the industry, people come in, they learn, and they can pick up bad habits. From what I'm hearing in the industry is someone that's been in 3 years is a little bit more cautious than some people even that's been in it for 27, because you take things for granted.
Right.
And we're seeing that. And that's the one thing we try to preach to everybody is whether you've been here 2 years, 2 months, 2 years, or 22 years, treat it all the same. You've remained in the utility business. Give us an idea of what type of work you do today.
Well, I've been in safety since 1997, and for the last 9 years I've served MB Haynes Corporation as the safety director. And we have 650 employees currently, and so I'm responsible for their safety. And those employees are broken up into 10 different divisions, so it's, you know, quite a gamut of job hazards. You know, we've got our line crews that are exposed to high voltage. We've got our signal crews working on the traffic signals that are exposed to vehicular traffic. And so, you know, my job is to keep them safe. We're constantly doing safety training. I'm responsible for handling all the workers' compensation claims if someone does get injured, and just doing what I can to keep them safe.
Since the accident happened in 1997, what kind of changes have you seen happen within the utility industry?
Well, there's been a big shift toward more safety. Specifically in 2014, OSHA revised the electric distribution standard, and so now they're mandating that we do job briefings at every job. You know, we go to a new pole, we got to do a job briefing. They ensure that employers provide the training and that the employees are trained to do the type of work that they're doing. There's the minimum approach distance, which means that we can only come within so many feet and inches of any energized conductor unless we cover everything up with our rubber hoses or rubber blankets and rubber hood. Another change is that we use a designated observer now anytime we're working on an energized pole, and that's someone like the foreman or a lead person that's familiar with the work. They'll sit there and that's all they do is sit and watch and make sure that, you know, nobody's getting too close to something and, you know, making a mistake. I'm not hearing near as much about electrical contact incidents as I did 20 years ago.
Fall protection's different.
Yes.
PPE, wearing the fire retardant clothing.
Yes.
I remember when it first came out, people used to complain it's so hot, but it's come a long way. You don't have those stiff pants anymore. They actually got a Carhartt jean and everything else, and it has just come amazingly around, and the safety is there.
Right. You know, back in the day, we free climbed everything, and you didn't really use the belt until you got up to your working position. But now OSHA requires that you use fall protection even when you're climbing. So that's been a big help. You know, you don't have people falling off the poles, because if they do cut out and fall, they just, you know, catch themselves because they only fall a couple inches. So that's been a big plus.
Bill, I really appreciate you taking the time, sitting down, talking with us, and telling us all about your story. Really glad to have you here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, buddy.